Hello, good morning. Good morning to the Caribbean and good evening to our friends in India. And welcome to our discussion on women's progress in the workplace, a Gen Z perspective. As we celebrate Women's History Month, the UWI Open Campus and Whiteboard Labs honors the strengths and power of women in their various roles at home, in the workplace, in society, and education. Today, we will hear from two outstanding women on how young women can be empowered and overcome gender stereotypes in the workplace. I'd like to introduce you to our panel who are leaders in their various domains. We will get individual insights on the challenges they face and how they overcame barriers and broke free of the stereotypes in personal and professional life. We'll also look at the Millennial woman, the Gen Z woman, and the ambitions of each. We'll also look at establishing a pathway for women of tomorrow to become leaders. We'll first hear from our very own Ms. Jamie Rocke, a program manager at the UWI Open Campus, and then from Ms. Samira Shipstone, a recruiter. We'll then have a segment for Q&A, and we'll then look at what next before we wrap up. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Jamie Rocke. Ms. Jamie Rocke is a Belizean born who has lived in and worked in the Caribbean, the UK, and the United States. She currently works as a program manager for the Continuing and Professional Education Center at the UWI Open Campus. Her personal and professional passions lie in development for vulnerable communities, innovation in education, and sustainable practices for a better, healthier environment. Jamie completed her Masters of Science in Public Sector Management and her undergraduate with a double major in Political Science and Law, both at the UWI. Jamie is a musician who plays in the Pantempa Steel Orchestra, a natural creative who enjoys painting, gardening, and cooking, and she is a dog mom to her loving puppy, Ivy. Over to you, Jamie.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks so much, Riaz. I'm just gonna jump right in and start sharing my screen as I start with my portion of the discussion. And I want to say that I was first a little bit intimidated to be part of a panel like this because I think like most millennials, you suffer from that kind of imposter syndrome, but I'm going to do my best to share my perspective and share my experience, as well as share a little bit of insight based on some research I've done, because it's interesting that the millennial generation is the most studied generation on our globe. So I hope that my part of the discussion today is insightful and that there's something that you can take away from our talk today. So I wanted to preface my discussion by saying that the bulk of what I'm going to share is going to be focused specifically on the millennial generation, because as you know, if you're familiar with the age range of the Gen Zers, they're not currently at that age where they have extensive experience in the workplace. So my presentation will focus mainly on millennials and how their experience can create a path or pave the way for what Gen Z employees can expect as they're entering the workforce. So the first part of my discussion, I wanted to look at who is actually a millennial, and I'll share with you some brief statistics. So according to the Pew Research Center, millennials are anybody born between the year 1981 and 1996, 1997, depending on the research that you look at. So the oldest millennial would be turning 39 this year. And Gen Z, of course, is anybody born after that, after 1996 or 1997. And the oldest Gen Z person would be around 24 or 25 years old. Millennials actually account for roughly 23 to 27% of the global population, with the highest statistics actually being in India, where about 58% of the global millennial population exists across Asia, with a whopping like 385 million being specifically in India. And that's by far the largest domestic population of millennials in the world. As of 2020, millennials make up 35% of the workforce. But by 2025, millennials are supposed to make up 75% of the workforce, and that's according to Statista. And it's interesting because as we progress and as the Gen Z population grows and evolves throughout the years, by that same time, the Gen Z population will shift from 24% currently to 35%. So a large part of our discussion today is quickly translating and evolving as we even speak. Some personal statistics that I wanted to share about Gen Z and millennials is that around 40% of millennials have a bachelor's degree or a higher education learning or training. And that's compared to about 30% of Gen Xers or baby boomers that were around the same age at this time in life. And so millennials are actually considered the most educated generation of our time today. And that's actually a reflection of a broader societal story, because within our generation, and I say ours because I'm a millennial, women are outpacing men in their levels of higher education, and that's according to Morgan Stanley. And there's a global change happening across and this is a global change that's happening across all regions. So in Europe and Asia, the Americas, Latin America, the Caribbean, and so it's encompassing or infiltrating every facet where women are stepping up and accessing and pursuing these different levels of education. And of course, with that, this affects their impact and their voice across different sectors, the way that they engage in grassroots initiatives, and from politics to finance and so much more. And so because of that, what we see is also within millennials a delay in traditional practices. So you see less millennials marrying young and having children young, because they're adopting these new values and these new belief systems and priorities, which focus on education and self-care and mental health practices, as well as society and community focused initiatives where they look at prioritizing the environment and people over profit, which was typically a priority for generations before them. Some other really quick facts about millennial is that they probably live with their parents, they're probably unmarried, and if they are in a relationship, it's long-term and more common law type relationship. And millennials actually suffer from more anxiety and depression than any other generation. So they're complicated human beings, but very influential in the way that we conduct our business, conduct our conversations nowadays. And I'm really excited to dive into the meat of my discussion today. So what I want to look at now is how does how does the workplace then benefit from having this generation of people in their workplace, specifically women. So millennials are actually, according to research by PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte, they do a global survey of millennials annually. Millennials are actually committed to their work as more or even more as their senior colleagues. And I wanted to share 5 benefits within this portion of my discussion on how millennials can add value and how workplaces can benefit from having them as employees. So millennials are considered entitled but hardworking. And what I mean when I say by that is that they seek out support, they seek out feedback, they seek out mentoring, and they feel that their opinions and their ideas are helpful and beneficial to the workplace, and they want them to be heard. So that means that they'll try their very best to add to the workplace, they'll try to add to discussion, and they try to be strategic with how they share those values and those opinions and those ideas. Millennials are also a little needy, but still independent in the same breath. And what I mean when I say about that is that they crave the support and they crave the guidance from their senior colleagues. They crave that one-on-one interaction to help them to be able to make informed decisions within the workplace that help them to be then independent, which is the ultimate goal of being effective as a result of learning from the guidance that's provided to them. Millennials are also high tech and high touch. And I always refer to millennials as the middle child, as the in-betweeners, because we're part of a generation that is coming off the cuff of traditionalism, where we still know what a cassette player is. We still know what it means to go to do things in a traditional sense, but we're still part of the age of social media and the rise of Industry 4.0 and technology. So we have the benefit of having insight and relating to both ends of that spectrum. And then finally, millennials are committed, but still leaving at the same time. A lot of research shows that millennials are committed because they're mostly committed to getting what they need, and they don't want to leave if they find a place where it's a healthy work environment, they're learning a lot, there are opportunities to grow. Millennials tend to be committed to the workplace. But in the same breath, uh, research shows that most millennials will stay a maximum of 12 to 24 months in any given place if they don't feel that they're being supported, if they don't feel either they're in a healthy work environment, or that their mental health issues or professional opportunities are not being made available to them. So fundamentally, millennials want to do interesting work. They want to enjoy the people that they work with. They want to be well compensated, which I think is something that we can all relate to, regardless of the generation that you're in. So next in my presentation, with with all the benefits that a workplace can have with millennials as employees. For millennials, there are certain biases and barriers that they experience within the workplace. And I found a really interesting article by the Seattle Times, which I'm going to use as the basis of this part of my discussion. So the first challenge that millennials tend to face within the workplace is what the author calls the likability factor. And I found this extremely interesting, especially for women in the workplace, because a lot of millennials feel that they have to navigate that fine line of being authentic and fierce. We're called to be these girl bosses and bold women leaders, but still have to walk a line of being likable and having success on the job, which is somewhat hard to achieve in real life. Clearer in theory, but a little bit harder to achieve in real life, especially when you come from a generation where there are certain gender norms that are still very prevalent, expected gender norms that are still very prevalent, where women are supposed to be welcoming and caring and modest. And when we encounter women who are direct or authoritative or bold, sometimes especially if there is a mixed bag of generations in the workplace, sometimes it could feel a bit contradictory, and sometimes persons don't know how to react to that. So the challenge is being assertive without being aggressive, and ensuring that your ideas come across as helpful rather than harmful. A second challenge that millennials tend to face is that the bar is usually set very high for young women in the workplace. And I think for women leaders in particular, this is a complicated problem, because the expectations of your work ethic oftentimes is perceived as you're supposed to do everything when it's asked, in a timeline that's set for you, and still also balance your work life and balance your personal life and balance your relationships. And sometimes that bar can be extremely overwhelming, which shows up in the research, where that speaks to the fact that millennials are now suffering from anxiety and depression and other mental health challenges even more frequently than other generations before them. Another challenge that millennials tend to face is the experience conundrum, and this is something I personally experienced as a millennial. Is that in the workplace, it's very highly competitive. So while millennials tend to be very highly educated, they also tend to have a really low level of relevant work experience. So it's very complicated if you're going to spend most of your time and effort in school earning a degree or a credential, but it still leaves you very little time to be able to get the necessary experience that most workplaces are asking for. And then, of course, the fourth challenge is managing microaggressions. And this was an interesting challenge that resonated not only with me, but I saw across different studies as well, is that especially within the workplace, there are certain microaggressions that millennials experience, from little phrases like someone saying, I'm old enough to be your father, I'm old enough to be your mother, or that was way before your time. And what persons in the workplace can be more mindful of is that microaggressions like that can have uh, contribute to the impact of a millennial or a Gen Zer feeling inadequate within the workplace, or feeling like they don't belong, or regardless of how good or how much value their ideas have or add to a workplace, it would there's still always the perception that it's coming from a place of you are new, you don't have the experience, you are only allowed a space at the table because we're trying to tick a diversity box. So that can also be a challenge um, for millennials, managing those microaggressions and managing how that translates into their perception of their contributions and the value that they add to the workplace. So then, what does a ideal workplace look like to a millennial? What does it look like to a Gen Zer? For me, I summed it up into what I call a millennial iOS. And if you're familiar with the Apple platform, the iOS is the operating system. And the first ideal characteristic of a workplace for a millennial is inclusivity, where there's a creative, supportive team environment where you're valued by not only your peers, but your predecessors, the women and men that you're learning from within your work environment. Because millennials tend to thrive in environments that focus less on competition and more on cooperation, where collaboration is fostered, open communication, team building, to ensure that your organization is the type of place that create pathways for ambitious young women, if they're given that opportunity and given a seat at the table in discussions that affect policy, that affect processes, that affect the overall vision and development of the workplace. Because a lot of millennials, you'll find that they feel that they're part of a generation that's been left to deal with a lot of the bad decisions or negatively impacting decisions that were made by generations before them. So now you have a lot of millennials speaking out, and Gen Z are speaking out against climate change and gender norms and systemic racism, because they are all for the idea that now in our generation we support inclusivity, we support wider, broader discussions that include every facet of society and every facet of who we are as humans. The second ideal characteristic of the workplace for the millennial is a place that provides opportunity, where opportunity to get training and development, where you're prepared and supported to tackle new leadership roles with relevant management training, with skills development, with learning programs that help young women and young men, new managers, to build confidence and advance their careers. But a lot of corporations, organizations, businesses see that as the tick the box standard continuing and professional development. But millennials want more than that. They want that guidance that would lead to substantive progression within their own careers and their own professional pathways. And then finally, an ideal workplace provides support where there's mentorship, where organizations, institutions, business set up ways for women to give back through mentorship and philanthropy. This is an important characteristics for a lot of millennials. Actually, research shows that millennials are the most philanthropic generation of our time currently. And no one knows the world of work better than ourselves if we are able to have a seat at the table, and we know we know the ways that we want to be supported, when we know the ways that we can show up for other female millennials. And so if there's the opportunity where women can be connected and provide mentorship from one generation to another, then that creates the pathway where millennials can then provide that kind of mentorship and that kind of support and guidance for the Gen Zers coming after coming after them. And I know that my colleague Samira is going to talk a lot more about how the connection between the millennials and the Gen Zers are relevant and happening now. So I'll stop my part of the discussion to pass over to Samira. So over to you, Samira.
Hi, thanks for that, Jamie. And before we hand over to Samira, I'd like to say, great job. And you raised some valid points. We live in a historic time as young women today, are venturing into more traditionally, male-dominated careers in science, tech, and engineering. And to add what you so rightfully said, millennials are the in-between child, and that reminded me of one of my favorite African proverb. It goes like, the youth can walk faster, but the elders knows the road. So it's something I actually framed on my wall, and it's a good reminder. So having good mentorship opportunities for young girls in the workplace is a step in the right direction. All right, so I'd like to shout out our viewers on Facebook and YouTube, and we encourage you to enter your questions in the chat, because it's a good discussion and we'd like to hear your thoughts and questions you may have. All right, so moving on, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So with a deep interest and commitment to organization management, behavior, and change, Ms. Samira Shipstone has acquired an all-round exposure, not only to my core subjects, but additional studies. Samira worked in PwC, supported them in the human capital segment, recruiting for management consulting and government reform infrastructure and development in their adversary online of service. Previously worked in Fidelity Worldwide Investment, wherein she has learned end-to-end recruitment process and further learned in detail the sourcing for niche positions and senior executive hiring, and also learned the process of strategizing and modeling human resources drives in lieu of the dynamic market conditions. So over to you, Samira.
Thank you so much, Yazin. Thank you so much, Jamie, for kind of laying the base for what millennials are and what Gen Zers are. Just to continue on what Jamie did say, there are a couple of points that are kind of brought to light when we sort of compare millennials to Gen Zers. Firstly, I think millennials are more idealistic in their way of thought, in their views, while Gen Zers are more pragmatic. And I think this also stems from the fact that millennials were kind of born during a boom period, while the Gen Zers were born more before a pre-recession and a recession time that kind of makes them more cautious as human beings, and also more immune to a lot of things, that sort of present themselves before any gens are coming along. Secondly, I also feel that millennials are more customer experience centric, whereas there's Gen Zers on the other side that are always looking at what monetary value does a certain product or a certain a certain experience bring to them, or bring to the table for that matter. Thirdly, what I also feel is that Gen Zers are always looking for a better innovation. I mean, while millennials are also there, we've got our new iPhones and we've got our new AirPods and everything, but I think Gen Zers have a more innovative side to them, and I think while yes, I do agree we are very entrepreneurial in our nature, I think they take it one step ahead and they kind of push us to our limits and tell us where we're oldies now as we speak. That being said, what I also feel is that there is an ecosystem that has been built around millennials, and which in a way would be a legacy for them, and in a way is something that I think they want to kind of make their own. And in the same way, they kind of have to build on it as well. Firstly, I think it's important that from a professional standpoint, I think it's very, very essential for them to have a very democratic style of management right from the start, right from when they begin their professional careers, irrespective of whether it is in a internship or whether they're doing a full-time job or a casual job or whatever it is. I think it's important that they have a very democratic style of management, which they kind of follow and which they kind of bring to the table as well. Secondly, I also, from a professional standpoint, it's very important that Gen Zers, have a personal touch to whatever they're doing. And this kind of helps employers in the way that, you kind of, this is the only way that you can attract them, develop them as a skill, and kind of retain their talent, so to speak, because they're very swayed. Gen Zs are, in fact, very swayed by newer innovations, newer ideas, newer terms of organization. So it's important for employers mostly at this point in time to go ahead and find ways in which you can go back and attract their attention, develop their skills, and of course retain them as talents as well. Thirdly, what I do feel is that Gen Zers are very aware of themselves as human beings, as entities of today. When you've got movements like a Time's Up or a Me Too, they're very, very aware of the fact that, what are their rights, what are their boundaries, what is it that they can achieve. So it's important for professionals who are already existing in an organization to kind of give them that leeway, because they know who they are, and, you can't build them or teach them anything new in that sense, because, with so much of digitalization and so much of social media involvement as of today, it's more than impossible to kind of teach them a new way of life, so to speak. So while they're very, very aware of themselves, I think it's important that we as employers, or we as millennials as well, give them that space to kind of grow within that span as well. Fourthly, I also feel that while, Jamie, I remember you did say that, millennials are the highest or have the vastest numbers of philanthropists within us. I think it's important that Gen Zers also come across as people who have a defined purpose for themselves, so to speak, in the sense that, they should know what their work-life balance is. They should be encouraged to take charge of their own careers. And I know of a lot of cultures wherein, the parents want their kids to do a certain type of course, or the parents want their kids to do a certain type of, or have a certain type of career only because that is what has been from previous years. And that's what they want to kind of continue with. But nowadays, with Gen Zs coming into the picture, I think they have a new defined purpose for themselves, and it's important that we as millennials and we as previous generations kind of respect that, and give them that leeway in terms of going ahead and making whatever they want to of the purpose, whether it's a work-life balance, whether it's taking a break between two terms, even while they're studying, just to go and do something on their own. It's important that we kind of give them that leeway. That being said, HR's role, or human resources role, is very dynamic in that sense, and it's evolving on a daily basis. Every day, we come across new experiences, we come across new situations wherein you need a different approach, and you just can't simply blindfoldedly go back and say, we did this in previous times and we can continue doing that, because that's just not how it works anymore. So I think it's important that for employers mostly, it's important that you go ahead and encourage equal pay, and similarly you also go ahead and encourage equal growth opportunities. So for a Gen Z, as I previously said, it's important that they see where the value is coming from. So it's important that they know what their growth opportunity is going to be. They just don't want to be stuck as an intern for the next 1.5 years. They want to move across the ladder and leaps and bounds as soon as they can, because they're very success driven, so to speak. Secondly, it's also important that the employee benefits are sensitive to the needs of the newer generation, so to speak. And quite honestly, I think that also stands true for our generations as well. For example, if there are women who kind of want to have an enriching personal life, I think an organization should be more than encouraging towards that. And if they want to build a family while they have their professional life going on, that should be a point of encouragement for organizations as well. Thirdly, I also feel that it is important, and while yes, we have grown as employers leaps and bounds in terms of recognizing the efforts that women put in while doing a certain job, I think it's important that that recognition is given to them on a more than regular basis, so that they feel valued, and that also kind of helps in retaining them as talent, in a longer run. Yes, so kind of, in a spur of a moment, women and men of all ages, while they kind of work together and they probably do equal work, and they probably even have equal amounts of efforts put in, it's important that employers, so to speak, go ahead and value both, and give them both equal opportunities, and more importantly, I think also have more training sessions, have more encouraging conversations with women, so that they feel more valued in their workplace. Right. That is from my end. I'm sorry, it's very short, but Jamie kind of covered most of it. This is mostly an HR perspective, so to speak.
Okay, great point, Samira. And as you stated, the workplace have to create that atmosphere that encourage young women to try. And it's often said that the youth is the future, and the youth have to bring around change. But oftentimes it's said, but it isn't really understood, because you can't expect the youth to change the future by clinging on to tools and traditions of the past. We have to change our mindset. So at this time, if we would like to hear from you, our viewers, any questions you may have, enter it in the chat. But to kick off the question and answer session, I'd like to pose a question here to the panel. So it's for both of you all, so I can get a different perspective. So how do we motivate Gen Zers and millennials within the workplace? So Jimmy, you want to take that first?
Sure. Thanks for that, Riaz. I think just as I'm referring back to the discussion and coupling that with my own experience, a major source of motivation for me is just being provided with the space and the opportunities to be heard, to share my ideas, share my contributions. And that motivation not only lies within being given those opportunities, but also being provided with the encouragement behind the scene, being given feedback and constructive feedback. I think that our generation relies very heavily on that one-on-one insight and that one-on-one guidance for to not only help millennials and Gen Zers fit into the workplace and fit into the culture and to fit into the vision and the mission of the organization, but also find their own sense of leadership style and find their own sense of professional authenticity. I'm really seeing, especially within my workplace, how that is something that's extremely valued. The fact that leadership is individual, and leadership is does not look like any one specific thing. It's something that you hone and that you develop as you are being provided these opportunities, as you are making mistakes and getting it wrong and getting the feedback that helps you to get it right the next time. So I think motivation lies within being provided the opportunity, being provided feedback, and being provided the space to grow and make mistakes at the same time.
All right, Samira, would you like to comment?
Right, I think further to what Jamie said, I think it's also important and a very, very, very essential motivation factor for any Gen Z, or rather for any millennial for that matter as well, is to be acknowledged for the efforts that have been put in in your workplace, and not only be acknowledged for it, but also be either more monetarily compensated for it, or in another way being, appreciated, so that, you're kind of motivated and you push yourself. I've hit my targets in the month of Jan. Let me do it again for the month of Feb again. That'll only come once you've got the backing of your managers, the backing of your organization. So it's very important that recognition is given in a timely fashion. It shouldn't come to you at the end of the year when everything is already done and forgotten about.
Yeah, and I really like that perspective, because I think that we, in a traditional sense, a laud or applause or congratulation is always given at the end of something, coming full circle as a cycle. But I think those small, that was great, or that's really good, or just saying I really appreciated that. That's very impactful on our generation, because our love language tends to be words of affirmation, especially within the workplace. That's our professional love language. So I really like that perspective, Samira.
Nice.
Okay, great. So we have another question here. Let me just pull up my sheet, right? So the question is, what inherent flaws do you think millennials and Gen Zers experience, which translates negatively in the workplace, and how can they work to correct or manage these flaws?
Can I take that first?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think it's actually not a flaw. I think it's just something that comes down from tradition and from whatever the organization is kind of following. I think you've got a lot of structural barriers put in place from day one. So that is flaw number one that I always feel that is there. Secondly, I think it's an institutional mindset that has to change altogether. I mean, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that takes months of review and re-review and going back and forth on it. So it's important that, you kind of clear all of that out, so that people who even work there 25 years are just as comfortable as somebody who's working there for 20 days. So it's important that these two prominent flaws are kind of pushed out of the way before anything else.
Yeah, and that speaks a lot to some statistics I mentioned earlier in my discussion, especially when it comes to the impatience of millennials. You want to move up the ladder really quickly, and if after a couple months you don't see it, then you want to cut the rug and just find something else. And I think that there is endearment in patience, and that there's endearment in waiting it out and seeing the how your development unfolds, especially within a specific career or a specific organization, so to speak. I think, and I also mentioned this at the start of my presentation, an inherent flaw of many millennials and maybe some Gen Zers as well, even though I think that, like Samira mentioned, Gen Zers tend to be more convinced of who they are as human beings. But especially with millennials, is that they have that imposter syndrome. They don't feel equipped, they don't feel competent, even though we're the most educated, we have dabbled in a lot of different jobs. You'll find, like myself, I've done so many different things, but you still feel like you don't deserve that place at the table, and so you suppress your ideas, or you suppress your feedback or your contributions, because you convince yourself that it's not worth sharing, or that it will be poorly received, or that
it's just not going to work out.
Or it's just not going to work, instead of allowing it to play out, or allowing it to be shared, and then having somebody else build on it, somebody with more experience, or somebody from your peers saying that's a great idea, but how about if we add this, or if we take off just this part. And so I think eliminating that that lie that we tell ourselves, that we're not equipped and that we're not capable. If you were hired, it means that they saw something in you to be able to do the job. So allow yourself to make mistakes, allow yourself to feel deserving of a seat at the table. And that confidence would then translate into your contributions and your ideas and what you add to your organization being seen and being appreciated, not just by the persons you share it with within the organization, but by yourself as well. So I think, yeah, that's a flaw that's that we really need to work on as a generation, and that hopefully we don't pass on to Gen Zers as they're entering the workforce.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for those responses. So we have a question here. So, you know, in the workplace now, there may be some issues between, you know, persons may have issues and they may not be getting the various support from each other. So our question is, and I pose this to Samira, and then we could get some feedback from Jimmy. How does one proceed when one does not feel you are receiving the necessary support from HR? So how do you proceed if you feel like you're not getting the support based on your particular situation? You're not getting the support from HR. So how do you proceed? What's the next step?
So I think, and I think Jimmy kind of agreed with me on this one. I think the first feeling is of rejection. The first feeling is of sheer demotivation at that point of time. You know, the next thing you want to do is kind of put down your papers and leave sometimes, because that's the first feeling of betrayal that you feel and nobody's really supporting you over here. And I think it's important to, at this stage, at this juncture, I think it's important to kind of take a step back, reanalyze what happened in that scenario, and try and see whether you can fix it, or try and see whether you know, it needs an improvement, or in fact also try and see whether you can, and if you're really convinced about your argument or your point or your case, or really try and see whether you can go back and speak to the person once again and, you know, get it through their head sometimes. You know, what I'm saying right now is what it should actually be. But yes, to answer your question, I think the first feeling is of a lot of demotivation, because I'm going to have to safely say that millennials of today and Gen Zers of today as well really put all their sweat and blood together to kind of get a project done or get a case file or whatever it is, whatever work that they're doing. So they're a very hardworking group of people. So whenever things aren't going their way, or whenever they do not find support from their managers or the organization, I think that kind of brings their morale down a little bit. So hopefully that shouldn't happen to anybody.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the first step is ensuring that you're targeting the right channels, making sure you're having the right conversations with the right persons. It's important that you know where you can go to if you're having certain issues. So if it's specifically labor related issue, you know, you speak to HR. Or if it's something that you're experiencing with across, you know, peer to peer, is that your direct supervisor? Is that the person you're supposed to have that conversation, or is it with the colleague? I think it's knowing who to start that conversation with first, and then also it's speaking up. I think we still live in this perception that people read our minds, or that our body language or that our facial expression is going to do the job to let people know what exactly we're thinking, when in reality, if you actually articulate how you feel not supported, or how you don't feel protected, or you don't feel empowered, or you don't feel uplifted, then persons won't know. And I think that if we are having these conversations authentically and honestly, and not from a place of that, not being disparaging or you know, disrespectful or unmannerly or rude, I think that also adds to relationship building. So knowing that person sees you as somebody who is authentic and willing to have a conversation if they're not feeling supported, and expressing ways that they can feel supported and how they can support you as well, or the organization if that's the situation. So I think knowing who to talk to and being honest about your truth is a great first two steps.
All right. So so I have a question here, but before I ask it, I just want to preface it by, you know, our millennials and Gen Zers tend to be more progressive on the work, and you know, we tend to be all out in technology, and we knows what's going on in the world a little more. And sometimes you can bring that perspective into the workplace, and you may seem to do things differently, and kind of us millennials and Gen Z, as we tend to challenge the norm. So my question is, do you think that young women feel that older women in the organization and leadership are supportive enough of their progress? So do you get that sense of support from the older women and in the organization and women in leadership? Do you feel you get that, okay, yes, I am empowering you? And I would also like to pitch this question to our viewers too. We like to hear your perspective on this as well. So comment in the chat if you think that older women in executive and leadership positions in your organizations are supportive of you. So I'd like to hand it over to our panels now.
Sure, I can start. I think, and this speaks to the managing microaggressions segment of my discussion, where I talked about the challenges and the barriers that a lot of millennial women tend to feel. And I'm sure millennial men as well, where previous generations, Gen Xers or boomers, sometimes do, not because of maybe they're trying to be mean or they're trying to be dismissive or anything like that. I think it's just when you've grown up in a culture where it's fight or be aggressive or as women stay quiet, and now you're coming in with this generation who is outspoken or who is authentic in their truth and are willing to share that, there can be a clash. But I think with everything, and I'm referring to a previous web jam where Dr. Sam talked about communication in the workplace, that's universal, and that's never going to go away, where if there are honest conversations, then there is less chance for there to be clashes. But I'm going around the mountain to come back to your question, Riaz. Obviously, within every workplace, there are going to be different generational clashes, especially because now you have an influx of millennials now merging with previous generations. I've personally experienced that, where there are, for no reason, older or previous generation men and women who don't tend to value the opinions or value your presence at all within the workplace, because you were just born yesterday, even though you were literally born more than a couple decades ago, and you bring your own experiences and your own your experiences to the workplace. So that's something that definitely persons of my generation tend to experience. But I have to say, I start with the bad and with the good, that within the University of the West Indies, I find that because a lot of our leaders are women, and a lot of our leaders are across the spectrum, different generations, I think that we've been empowered to a great extent to feel that we do have a place at the table, and that we do have opportunities to have our opinions and our contributions be heard. And I think that all boils down to not just effective leadership, but just being an empathic human being, period. I think it's a part of that personal decision where I don't just view this person, I don't just view this colleague as a millennial, or I don't just view this colleague as a Gen Zer. I view this colleague as a colleague and a human being who brings experience different from mine, but relevant because they're here to the workplace. They bring their ideas that allows you to have a shift in perspective. So yes, I agree. I do think that there are many instances where millennials feel babied or they feel mistreated because of their age, but there are many workplaces where, because of their age, millennials are empowered and held on the shoulders of the person before them, because they understand the value of paving the way for future generations as well.
Okay, Samira.
So, just a couple of statistics. Amongst the Fortune 500 companies that we have of today, there are only 19% that have women as a part of their board of directors. And of all of that, there is only 4% of the Fortune 500 companies where women are actually seated as CEOs. So when Gen Zers or millennials kind of feel they're not being supported by seniors who are women, it's not coming from a negative place, but it's actually just, and this is my personal view, that I think it's actually just coming from a place of tough love, because they've really had to go through the grind to make it to that 4%. So, and I think they're only going to be supportive of your ideas, and they're only going to be encouraging of your ideas in a certain way, because that's probably the way they've learned it all these years. So instead of right, it's important that your communication is there. It's important that you have honest conversations with your seniors at all given points of time. But it's also important to realize that it's taken them a lot of hard work, and it's taken them several years to reach where they are. So if they're being mean to you, it's not because you've probably done something wrong, but it's maybe because they know that you have a certain potential as a millennial or as a Gen Z that you can achieve, and then you're just being lazy about it, and you're just not working as hard as we should be. So I don't think it's cases where they don't support you. I think it's just a case of sheer tough love, nothing else.
Great. All right. So let's see if we have any other questions. I see a comment here. So this was an earlier comment. Thank you, Samira. HR is very important in helping the other persons in the organization to understand how to support young women employees. So that's a comment from Principal Luz Longsworth. Again, I would like to encourage our viewers to enter any questions you may have in our chat. And as we come to close, Jamie and Samira, do you have any closing remarks?
Samira, do you want to go since I started off?
just based on the questions we have, and just any and just to give you some like a direction as to how do you think that, in your perspective, that the current workplace now could be a little, I mean, yes, there have been things are being done to empower women in the workplace, but what do you see, like what you would like to see happen in the short term?
Yes, thanks, Riaz. I think it's as you rightly said, there have been things moving in the direction of certain improvements where women in workplace is concerned, and I can only hope that it continues in that way. But I think my main and key takeaway from whatever Jamie has shared and whatever you've shared as well, I think, is that it's important that women of today kind of hold their ground, are kind of authentic in their manners of conducting themselves in a workforce place. And it's exceptionally crucial that millennials and Gen Zers do maintain an accurate work-life balance. I'm not saying that, be lazy and don't do anything. And similarly, not saying that, work 16 hours a day and then come home and just crash. But it's important that you have an accurate work-life balance, because that's the only way that you can kind of move ahead in your life and move from pillar to pillar. Otherwise, you're never going to make it to the 4% of Fortune 500.
Thanks, Samira. I think I'm going to sound like a broken record, because I think my closing remarks would be that it all boils down to inclusivity. And I think that a lot of our generation, like I mentioned before, they felt left out of decisions that were made on their behalf that affect our generation now, that we are now supposed to fix. And so how we change that culture and how we change that narrative is by being given a seat at the table. If you're in a senior position of leadership and you have a millennial in your workplace, bring them to a meeting with you. Have one-on-one sessions where you just talk about what their expectations are, how they're managing in the workplace, where it's not you're giving them a task, where you're having real conversations with them to validate not only their experience, but like validate their desires and their ambitions as they're going forward. So encouraging a workplace where inclusivity is encouraged and persons feel like they have a seat at the table, even if all their ideas aren't adopted, even if all their contributions aren't implemented as policy and as Bible, that they're allowed to just even voice it. And I think that's at the end of the day what millennials and Gen Zers want, that their opinions and their contributions are heard. And it also gives them that space to work on what they contribute. So maybe I have a bad idea today, but tomorrow that motivates me to have a better idea, or to have collaborative discussions that help me to create collaborative ideas that help with the overall development of a workplace, or just the workforce in general. So that would be my closing remarks.
All right. Thank you very much, Jamie and Samira. So, in closing, if we're all here and we're all sharing these discussions, it means that we believe these conversations and these spaces are necessary and impactful, because what we have to do now is articulate that in a way that it would be transferred into the organization, where we have commitments that will ensure that all of us work together from both generations, current generation, the future generation, and past generation, how we work together, how we share ideas and coach and mentor young ladies and women who are now entering the workplace to become leaders of tomorrow. So with that, I would like to thank everyone. I would like to thank Jamie and Samira for an excellent job. I would like
Thank
to
you
also...
so much. Thank you for moderating. You're superb.
Thanks very much.
I second that. I second
Agreed.
that.
I would also like to thank our colleagues from Whiteboard Labs. I'd like to thank Dr. Rohit Shipstone. I'd like to thank Ashish. I'd like to especially give a shout out to our principal, for empowering us as young people, and especially as Jamie would have said, continuing to empower young women in the open campus to, break down these stereotype barriers and, be the best they can be. I would also like to thank our technical team. I would like to thank our marketing team, Dr. Cleveland Sam, Patrick Johnson, Cherise Glasgow, David, I'm sorry, I didn't get your last name.
Foster.
David Foster, Ashish Kumar. I'd like to also thank our viewers from Facebook and YouTube who has joined us today. And we've looked at the youth perspective. So what's next? So join us again on March 21st when we look at women leadership in society. So don't forget to like our Facebook page, like our YouTube page, so you can get these notifications anytime we go live. All right. So I would like to thank everyone. It's 9 a.m. in the sunny Caribbean. It's a little raining outside, but it's fine in Trinidad here. I'd like to say good morning to those in the Caribbean, and have a good evening to those in India and wherever time zone you are. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for future discussions surrounding women empowerment in the Caribbean.